Hello and welcome to the recorded version of Looking at Student Thinking Protocol. This was the topic of the November monthly workshop for TGR Foundation Professional Learning team. I'm very happy that you've come to look at this video. This is a slightly modified version because it's not being run as the live version. This is being a special recorded version just for you joining and looking at this video. But there will be some guidance in how you can still have a similar experience to those that joined in live. So let's go ahead and get started. First off, for those of you who are not familiar, I just want to share that TGR EDU Create is the professional learning team at TGR Foundation. And we are very committed to a professional learning program that incorporates interdisciplinary approaches with inquiry-based student-centered content focused on STEM, college access, and career connections. And so we're very happy, again, you've joined this video and would love to connect with you live or in person in the near future. My name, so without further ado, is Jason Porter. I'm the Director of Professional Learning for TGR Foundation. And so my background is both as a research scientist in the areas of microbiology and ecology, but also a pretty much a lifelong biology and ecology educator and leader, and have been with TGR Foundation for just about 5 years now. So very happy to take you through this workshop together. A few things that you may see through this video, some of these icons that just kind of show you some of the opportunities. They're somewhat limited as we go through the recorded version here, but I'll share with you as we get there ways that you can have similar experiences to those that were in the live workshop as we get to these different icons. All right, so getting to our agenda. So the main things that we're talking about today is first, the making thinking visible paradigm of really kind of thinking in your classroom and assessment. So how can educators include thinking as a hallmark to their students and have it be something that is ever present so that students are always kind of thinking about what has changed about their thinking, what are new ideas that they hadn't had before, and constantly going through that journey is how is every classroom experience, every homework assignment, every exam, every project-based learning opportunity, how do these add to or change their thinking? And they're constantly thinking about that idea. And then the other part of this is the last protocol, the looking at student thinking protocol, that really connects to if you're running classroom opportunities in the making thinking visible paradigm, and you want to look for evidence of students thinking within the work that they're handing into you, this protocol is a great way to do that. So that's what we're going to talk about today and share with you how you can utilize these really powerful tools to inform instruction in your classroom. All right, and before we get to those two agenda items, I did just want to share that TGR Foundation, a professional learning team, has an inquiry progression. And so we have 4 different what we call STEM studios, which are multi-day trainings. Currently, these are all virtual trainings and will continue to be for 2022. And there are 4 different topics within these, all of them aiming towards thinking about inquiry and how you can use inquiry as a tool in your classroom to really develop student agency. So the first of these is the inquiry mindset, and it's about how we're preparing for inquiry in our classroom as educators. The second of these modules is inquiry practice, and this is really connecting to our making thinking visible paradigm. And the question here is, what inquiry practice are you integrating into your work? So once you've developed that inquiry mindset, then what are you doing that perpetuates inquiry in your classroom? The third one is the inquiry environment. So how do you set up an environment, both space, but also more kind of a philosophical environment, so that inquiry works, right? And it's clear to students that it's something you value as an educator. And so all of you can lean into the opportunities for inquiry in the classroom and in your teaching environment. And then finally, really kind of thinking about student-led inquiry. So getting to that point where you can start to hand over some of the reins to the students and they can really get some of the full benefits of inquiry by looking for opportunities to have students drive their own inquiry and their own learning and their own thinking. And I mention this because the making thinking visible paradigm is a big part of our Inquiry 2. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about it today, but if you're intrigued and want to know more and are interested in taking this journey with us, please reach out. There'll be contact information below in the description. Reach out and let us know that you'd like to be involved, and we can look at the opportunities for that for you, for people in your school, in your district, and potentially beyond. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this making inquiry visible. So kind of summing it up here in this quote a little bit, from Richard and Church, and we'll talk about the resource material, the text that we've really leaned on a lot for a lot of these ideas. So it's really the idea of visible represents not just what can be seen, but what we can perceive, notice, and identify. So how is it obvious to you what your students are thinking? How is it obvious to you how your students' thinking is changing? How is it obvious to your students what you were thinking and how your thinking changes over time or has changed over time in your learning journey? So that's really what this paradigm is talking about. Is it's really about students being very cognizant of their own thinking and being active members of curating that thinking over time. Okay, and so here's the resource that I referred to from Richard and Church of Making Thinking Visible. This is an amazing text. They have some other versions of this one as well, and definitely I'll put in the description a great website for you to get more resources from. So definitely recommend you to check out this. If you do join our Inquiry 2 or Making Thinking Visible, get into that progression, we provide a copy of this text to all those who participate. So let's talk about why making thinking visible is useful, right? What's some of the power of it? And first, let's talk about for students specifically. So for students, it can really foster deep learning. Okay, so them really kind of understanding what they're thinking and seeing how that's changing over time. So they're really having this metacognitive journey on how learning is happening over time. It can really cultivate engagement, right? So have students be very engaged, very interested in what's going on because it's so personal, right? It becomes so much about them and their journey. Flips the roles a little bit, which really kind of leads the preparation, right? Students being a little more in charge of their learning and what kind of thinking and discussions and learning happens in the classroom that can be really important for students, especially as a preparation for their next steps outside of their K through 12 journey. Enhancing formative assessment, because formative assessment is really based on what are students taking away from, what are students understanding, what are students thinking about from a small learning opportunity, right? Kind of in the moment. And if you're constantly perpetuating thinking in your classroom, it turns almost every opportunity into a formative assessment. So it's really this paradigm is really steeped in formative assessment, which I think is probably one of the most valuable tools for classroom educators. So that's a good one to focus on. Improving learning, and you can see they're even on standardized tests. So this one especially, because you'll see something called thinking routines are so embedded in this, you can really align that to standards and to information that students are going to have to understand and really get a granular idea of where's their thinking going and what are some gaps in thinking or some challenges they're having that are keeping them from not being successful or not as successful on testing. And then finally, really developing these thinking dispositions. Okay, so that's the power to the students. Let's look at for educators. Where's that power? So for educators, it's leading into things like developing better listeners and better listening within your classroom. You can learn to encourage student initiative, right? So educators can really understand how to empower students and have them be active participants in the learning. You can gain new insights in the student learning. So deeper understanding of where's their learning going, right? What are they thinking about? What does the topic that you're covering now relate to the topic you covered before and the topic you're going to cover later through the student's eyes, right? So really kind of having this deep understanding of where they are. the instruction can be so responsive in this, right? And planning for responsive instruction, that's really what that looking at student thinking protocol is about. So when we get there, you'll see that it's like, yeah, you can have a plan for where you're going to go next, but then you can also mitigate that plan a little bit based on what are students thinking about as they're going through the assignments, and what are their actual experiences with day-to-day lessons, and what's kind of needed next on that journey. So it really becomes a very rigorous and responsive method for teaching day-to-day. More reflection, both for the educator and promoting that reflection within the classroom, and then being responsive with real-time feedback. Okay. So I think you probably agree that all of these are pretty powerful things, and things that we want both for our students and for ourselves as educators as we're working with our students. And you might be saying, great, sounds good. So what? So what's next? So what do I do? How do I actually do this, right? Okay, I kind of get what you're saying about making thinking visible. I get some of the power and awesome. So how does one actually do it? Well, let me kind of lay out these integrative practices for making thinking visible. And that's what the MTV refers to, making thinking visible. And these are practices really laid out by Pritchard and Church really nicely in their text, and some that we cover also in our Inquiry 2 module in our learning progression, is questioning, listening, documentation, and thinking routines. So these are things that you really want to embed in your instruction and make very regular instrumental parts of the work you do as students in order to have thinking be visible in your classroom. Okay, so when we're talking about questioning, we're talking about teachers facilitating student curiosity and thinking. So really kind of perpetuating that wonderment, right, in your classroom, and having kids really, that's interesting. I wonder why this or why that, and exploring it. Okay. And then students really asking themselves how to ask good questions to drive their thinking, right? So questioning is one thing, and we can get students to question, but how do we get them to understand the questions that drive you forward, right? You can ask lots of questions, but there's typically, specific questions that move you to the next step in a learning progression. And so we want students to be good at that, right? And have opportunities to practice that within the content learning that they're doing. Listening, right? And there's more than one type of listening. And so this is something that you can dig into to learn more about in the making thinking visible paradigm. But there's empathetic listening and educative listening and generative listening. This is something that I think all of us, especially adults, can learn to do a lot better. So what are we listening for? Are we listening for student understanding? Are we listening for student achievement, right? The student there's maybe a gap there in their understanding and they're not finding as much success. Listening for why that might be, right? They'll tell you if you listen close enough. And so, what are those opportunities for listening, both on the educator standpoint, but also on the students, and helping them understand how they can become better listeners as well, and really connect to what's happening in the moment in a classroom or in a learning environment, instead of kind of just hopping to the next point without a deep understanding. Documentation. So documentation is an important part of every classroom anyway. And this involves practices of observing, recording, interpreting, and sharing products of thinking. Okay, so this is really about products, and again, connects very well to this looking at student thinking protocol. And it's about kind of how can you document a trail of thinking and learning through all of the lessons and through your entire work with the students. So it's really giving an opportunity to pay attention to and have written down, have documented what is the thinking that's happening in that classroom. So again, you can dig much deeper into this, and suggest that you do. And I've already shared kind of some ways that you can go about doing that. And then finally, thinking routines. And these are really important to making thinking visible. These are these central practices for making thinking visible. And there's a lot of them, definitely on the Richard site that I'm going to share, shared in the description. Take a look there. There's lots of different thinking routines that you can take a look at, and they share with you kind of how you use those under different circumstances. So definitely suggest you check that out. But as far as thinking routines, let's practice one now, right? And so I'm going to kind of lay out for you this thinking routine. how we went about this in the live workshop, and then your opportunity to do this from the recorded video. So the thinking routine we're going to utilize here is think, puzzle, and explore. Okay. And think, puzzle, and explore is a way for you to really connect to some learning that you're doing so that you can think about it. How does it connect? Prior knowledge, puzzle, questioning, and finally exploring it deeper. And so we can see here the way that we did this in person in the live webinars we shared on a Jamboard. I'll show you what that looks like. And I'll share a link to that Jamboard in the description below. And this is an opportunity for you to also do the same thing. So the think part of this is how have you implemented these integrative practices in your classroom? Okay, so if we go back for a second and we say questioning, listening, documentation, and thinking routines, how have you already used those in your classroom? Even if you've never heard of making thinking visible before, you probably have some experience with those. So what have you done in the past? Okay. What questions or puzzles do you have about making thinking visible? So what are the questions, right? What are things that come to mind as you think about what you've done in the past and as you heard what I was rolling out about this paradigm? And finally, how do you think you could explore those puzzles, those questions about making thinking visible to your classroom? Okay. And so this, in the live workshop, this was an activity for participants to share their ideas, had about 10 minutes to share their ideas on the Jamboard. And then we had a discussion about this. The Jamboard looked like this. So the think, the puzzle, and the explore. And then an opportunity for participants to write down their different experiences. And you can do the same thing. And honestly, what I recommend is to pause right here to either actually go to the Jamboard and add them on there if you'd like to, or to just do it analog using some sticky notes or a pad of paper or something like that, but to write down, so what have you already done with making thinking visible? What are your questions about it? And how do you think you'd explore these questions further? Okay, so please pause here if you'd like to, or come back to this later in the video, but take an opportunity to think through this. And this is a thinking routine. So this is also giving you an opportunity of a thinking routine, how it works and how you could use this with your students. Okay, so if you've paused and now come back, welcome back. If not, glad you're still here. So let's kind of move on to, starting now to unlocking student thinking. So we're moving past the paradigm of making thinking visible. Again, the reason that we had to share that is because the looking at student thinking protocol is meant to be used for work products that were handed in by using these questioning and listening and documentation and thinking routine practices, right? So it's kind of assumed that you're already utilizing some of those things. Again, you likely are in some way. And so this will connect to how can this protocol be useful for this really responsive teaching cycle in your classroom. Excuse me. Okay, so how do we use thinking as a guide to instruction? And again, this is setting us up for this looking at student thinking protocol. The protocol is used well for analyzing student thinking of work that's been handed in from a lesson, so a work product from a lesson or from a unit or something like that. Okay. The format we recommend, it's really great to do this in a small group of teachers, right? And small meaning kind of somewhere in the 3 to 6 or so range. And the reason this is good is because it gives perspective on what are you seeing from the product being so close to it and having assigned it, what are others seeing in the product, and what's kind of the next step you can go. So you obviously couldn't do this, every time a student handed in a work product from a lesson. But maybe it's something you could work into a weekly or a monthly routine where you can sit down with content teams or grade level teams, or even just some other educators that you work with well, and have a chance to sit down and share each other's work products and get some perspective on, okay, where's the thinking that we see within these work products and what does it suggest about next steps, right, for these students. And then the timing, so typically this takes about 60 to 90 minutes for about 3 to 4 teachers. And so it gives you an idea of how much time you'd have to budget to do this process. Okay, so let's start looking into these actual protocol. Again, down in the description, you'll see a link for the protocol so you can check it out. I've chunked it here so you can see the different steps of the protocol. And see, there'll also be, I'll show you how you can use a little practice to get yourself used to kind of the main part of the protocol for analyzing student thinking. Okay, so the first part of this is for the presenter, right? So that's the educator that has some student work that they want another group to help them analyze. And so you're bringing this to the group. They kind of give a context for this task. So here's what we did. Here was the learning intention. Here are the objectives. And then here's the work product, right? So kind of laying out, here's what it is, right? And then the next step is for everyone to read it, right? So to take a look at the product, it might be an essay, it might be a poster, a thinking map, could be an assessment, but probably would have to be more of a free response kind of assessment. So most work products can work for this, but to look at it, right? And to take notes for comment, and to categorize your notes that fit with the stages of the protocol. You'll see the rest of the stages here in just a moment, okay? All right, so let me actually go ahead and frame that right now. So I do have a bit of student work that I brought, which is an interesting piece of work that I want to share with all of you. And so let me do that. Let me frame that as kind of the presenting teacher. Again, there'll be a link to this work below. Also link to a Google slide that you can use to analyze this a little bit to get some of that common practice that those in live workshop did. So you can find those links below. But anyway, okay, so here's the work and let me frame this. So the context is the students were responding to an article on a refugee experience. Okay, and this was happening for World Refugee Day. They used the notice, perspective taking, same and different routine. So you can see that on the work, notice, perspective taking, same and different. So they were trying to relate to refugee experiences based on the reading they were doing and the learning they were doing for World Refugee Day. And this was part of mentioned that part of a classroom recognition for World Refugee Day. And students were asked to share their thoughts on the refugee experience and how it related to their own experience. Okay, and so that kind of gives some of the context for what students were doing here. Okay. And there's just a bigger sample of this work. Again, what I would suggest, that this is kind of step 2 that just rolled out of the protocol. Pause the video here, take a look at this work product, kind of read through it and see what you note about what you see there. There is a link below in the description for you to look at a larger version of this work product as well. So feel free to take a look at that. Okay, so after you've had a chance, you saw the context and look at that student work. The next step is now as a group to have a conversation about not just the work product holistically, but the thinking, right? What do you see there in the thinking and what does it make you think? What does it make you think of the kind of the next steps here, okay? So this part of the discussion and analysis, the presenter is mostly silent, taking notes, because they're really trying to get perspective from others of what they think. There might be some opportunities for comments from the presenter here and there, but for the most part, they're listening, right? Which is an important part of making thinking visible. They're listening to what their colleagues see and note, and making, documenting handwritten notes about what they've heard, okay? So the first part is describing the work. So what do you see in the work itself, okay? The second part is speculating about the thinking. So the first part is, okay, what do you overall see? You're not trying to necessarily interpret and just point out there, but raise awareness of features like, oh, that's an interesting part. That's an interesting part. Oh, I see they were specifically responding to this routine and they may not have said that otherwise. Those kinds of features. Then in the second part, it's speculating about the thinking. So where do you see students thinking? What things that are written there or demonstrated there are like, okay, this was not just a direct pull from what they read or saw. This is them bringing in some ideas of their own that relates to what they're reading or what they they saw. So where do you see that happening? The next part is asking questions about the work. So what questions does the work raise for you? And it is important to note that these are questions about the thinking and understanding, not questions about the lesson themselves. So questions about the lessons themselves should come out earlier than this. Those really should be clarifying questions you ask the presenter earlier on to get some of that context. And so, okay, I understand this enough to analyze it. When you're asking questions about the work in part 3 here, this is really about the thinking. Okay, so what did the thinking you see here raise for you? Either like, oh, wow, this connects so well into what was going to happen next because of blah, blah, blah. Or, whoa, this is maybe a flag for me, is this student is going in this direction and maybe the intention is for them to go in that direction. So how do we square that, right? How do we make that work? And then finally, discussing implications for teaching and learning, and related to what I just said. So where might the work go next to further extend and build on students' thinking? Okay, and that's both in terms of extending thinking and also in terms of avoiding misconceptions. So both of those are valid in that section. Okay. So within the live workshop, the opportunity was for groups to break up together, to go into breakout rooms on Zoom, and to go through the 4 analysis steps that I just described of the looking at student thinking protocol. We shared a Google slide, which I've also shared in the description for you, and they could take notes on the thinking they noticed and be prepared to share individual takeaways. So it's kind of up to you what you want to do. If you're interested in kind of pausing here and either getting a group together or going through this individually, just to try and understand and learn. If you would rather say, no, I want to kind of just take this protocol and look at my own student work right away, and just kind of jump into the protocol, that's fine. But if you feel like this practice would be useful, then please feel free to pause and go through that now. And you can see that this is, here's a copy of the Google slide where it shows through those 4 steps of the really analysis portion of the protocol, and the questions you're asking, purpose and guidance, and then can take notes on what you notice there. So feel free to go ahead and use that practice work to do that. Or if you just want to kind of take the protocol wholesale and start looking at your own student work using it, that's fine too. All right, and then the final part of the protocol, this is where the presenter comes back into the conversation, okay? So now the presenter is going to respond to the discussion. So what have they learned? What have they thought about from listening to these discussions? What's their reflection? So on the protocol itself, so how did the process feel? And this can be like, if it is going to be a regular routine, which I really do recommend, the most benefit from this is if you build it into a routine with others in your school and related to your teaching context. If you're going to do that, can be feedback on, oh, let's set it up this way or that way for next time so it will be better. And finally, thanking the presenting teacher and the documenter. So everyone showing gratitude for the work that you did together. So that's the kind of ending part of this. It can be, I've done a lot of protocols similar to this and use this protocol quite a bit. It can be really tempting to skip this part. I would strongly recommend against that, right? You might be saying, oh, we'll save a little time. This reflection part I found for me, and thinking about, okay, what did it make me think about when I heard this discussion, and how does it make me think now and what I want to do next, and relate to my teaching. It's really important to kind of formulating a plan, right? You're not necessarily going to have a completely sound plan in a few minutes within this conversation, but it at least gets you to a place where it's like, okay, I know my starting off point. I kind of have an idea of where I'm going to jump from, and then we'll build that out more later. If you don't do this, you can leave a little overwhelmed and not knowing where to go because all these different things were mentioned. So really do recommend include this as a part of this protocol time. Okay, and so kind of we're coming towards the end here in this video. In the actual live workshop, we gave participants an opportunity to talk about what were they thinking as they explored student work. Certainly, if you want to pause here and think about that yourself, write down some notes. If you would like to reach out to myself and to our professional learning team at TGR Foundation and share some of those ideas, please do that as well. You can reach us at TGR EDU Explore, TGR EDU Create at tgrfoundation.org. That email address will also be down in the description. So if you'd like to share your takeaway from this and discuss anything, please reach out and we would be happy to do that with you. As far as staying connected, these monthly digital workshops happen on the third Wednesday of every month up until June. They take a little bit of a break for the summer and then they start back up in September. We are having one December 15th about interdisciplinary learning. So we strongly recommend, if you're interested, please join us. There is a link at the bottom if you would like to register for one of our monthly workshops. There's a link in the description, so please check that out, register, and join us live, right? So hopefully you've gotten something out of this recorded experience. I absolutely guarantee you that the in-person experience is much more interactive, much more collaborative, and there's more opportunities to really kind of get those creative juices going. So recommend you join us for the live experience as you're available. And in closing, we have some other opportunities here. You can stay connected with us. Please check out our website, which will be linked in the description, as well as our Facebook educator community. So would love to hear from you, would love to stay connected. We'll love to see how can we support you as an educator in all the hard work that you're doing working with your students to make sure that students are getting as empowered and as much agency out of their learning experiences as possible. So I want to thank you very much for joining and for your attention, and look forward to seeing you soon. Bye-bye.